Hey nerds, Farmer Jesse here. Welcome to Growers Daily, your daily dose of ecological farming insight. It is Thursday, April 3rd, 2025, and today we're going to talk about, if it matters, which way you orient your garden beds, old horse manure, getting an old pile of manure composting. I guess manure is kind of a vibe today, or a theme. Honestly, I'm a little bit too old to know the difference, so let's do it. All right, well, welcome to Thursday, everyone. But oh boy, is it a stormy, wet week here all of a sudden. We had tornado warnings going off around 1:45 a.m. here, which means I've basically been awake since then. And we are looking at roughly 8 to 12 inches of rain over the next couple of days, with some areas forecasting like 17 plus inches of rain. Surrounding states are honestly not in much of a better boat. And I mean, that's probably not the best choice of phrases there, but very exciting stuff. Our farm is not at risk of flooding, but there are low-lying areas in and around the region with farms that are in those sort of low-lying areas. So we're thinking of you all. As I record this, we are still technically in a tornado watch, so wish this show luck. All right, so as is kind of tradition on Thursdays, we will take on 3 Patreon questions from our Patreon page to make sure we are staying caught up over there. If you are a Patreon member and have either a question or just a topic suggestion, make sure to drop it in the show notes there at patreon.com/no-till-growers. All right, our first Patreon question of the day comes from Patreon member James Clint Nurnberg, who writes, quote, "Here's a question about bed orientation. My wife and I recently moved to a 40-acre family property in southwestern Missouri, and there's finally ample space for a larger garden. Based on my latitude and so forth, what are the considerations for setting up the beds? Should they run north-south or east-west? There isn't much slope there where I plan to build the first beds this spring, but to what extent should drainage concerns guide the orientation?" End quote. Okay, so great stuff. Great question. So I know I've talked a bit about garden orientation a couple times over the last couple months, but not as much about specific bed orientation. So I have come to think a little bit differently about bed orientation over the last few years, and it's because I sometimes hear that bed orientation is important because you don't want to block too much sunlight or you want to trap the rain or whatever. And I suppose in terms of sunlight, that can be true in specific situations, but for the most part, the sun is going to come straight over top of the gardens when the tall stuff is at its tallest, like at the peak of the growing season. So I don't worry too much in general about losing growth to sunlight in terms of how I would orient the beds. What I worry more about with bed orientation is 2 things. 1, drainage, and 2, wind. Now, for drainage, being that you're in a relatively wet part of the state, ideally you would want your garden paths to be able to help you drain some of that water away. In a drier area, maybe that would not be the case, though I have seen farms in Southern California run into erosion issues in the wet part of the season by having their beds on contour across the slope as opposed to just going down the slope. So something that you have to keep in mind no matter where you are. It seems attractive to want to stop the water, but water is ornery and it's going to find its way down the hill one way or another. It will move to the lowest spot, fill it, and then climb over whatever is in its way, like a garden bed, taking soil with it. So in this case, it's less about north, south, east, west as much as just pointing them, downhill to let the drainage do its thing. Drainage would take precedence for me, honestly. It's a challenge. On a flat property and or where drainage ain't the issue, then wind is my next determining factor. If I want to have low tunnels, high tunnels, or shade houses, any broad side of a temporary structure, then I would prefer those beds to be facing the prevailing winds, i.e. for us, they would be pointed sort of south or kind of southwest. Having the broad side of a structure, especially a temporary one, but definitely also a giant plastic one like a greenhouse or high tunnel, vulnerable to the wind, is a disaster waiting to happen. So if you don't face all of your beds towards the prevailing wind, definitely face your structures that way as much as you can. I also prefer to put large structures on the north side as to avoid shading the garden too much. Of course, if you're sitting there like, well, fudge, I did it wrong, don't sweat it. Don't feel like you have to tear everything up and start again. Just consider putting in some wind blocking hedgerows to help block the wind, and listen to the last week's episode on windbreaks for more info on that. For the most part, stuff will be fine no matter how you orient your beds. And if shading is the concern, work that into your crop plan in the winter. Anyway, I hope that helps. And otherwise, we'll take a quick break. And when we come back, old horse manure and the people who love it, BRB. Today's episode is brought to you by Rimmel Greenhouses.
Whether it's tomatoes to market, flowers in the spring, or your family's harvest, growing in a greenhouse protected from the weather provides the right environment that you need for a harvest that you can count on. Rimmel Greenhouses are designed for durability and offer the quality that you need to grow productively year-round. Visit rimmelgreenhouses.com to get a quote today.
If I may editorialize for a second, I own a Rimmel tunnel. I love it. We built it ourselves, and I really appreciated the quality of the tunnel as well as the customer service we received in the process. So make sure to check them out. If you, the listener, are enjoying this content, getting even a small amount of value from it, consider supporting our work over at patreon.com/no-till-growers. I will try to get to questions from everywhere that questions come in, but I will always get to your Patreon questions. Now, today's second Patreon question comes from Patreon member Mike at Think Little Farm, who is our new editor. Hi, Mike.
Hey, everybody. Mike here, your brand new No-Till Growers editor. I just wanted to take a second to say hello, introduce myself, and tell you all how excited I am to help you get the farming content you deserve. So, today's Patreon question comes courtesy of me. I'll read it. Happy March. Question regarding manure. I am moving onto a property with several horse stalls. They are all full of manure from previous tenants. I'm wondering if there is any way to use it productively as compost. It's at least a year old. My worries would be 1, it is just too old to contain any actual ecological goodness. And 2, I don't know where the horses got their food and may have eaten hay or something else treated with nasty stuff. Any thoughts on using old horse manure of relatively unknown origins? Bad idea entirely? Thanks, Farmer Jesse.
All right, so great question here, Mike, and obviously congrats on the new property with this awesome resource. So some things to think about with old horse manure. First is that horse manure doesn't have a ton of nitrogen to begin with, but much of the nitrogen, depending on how old it is, will likely have broken down, which can be both good and a little negative. On the good side, that means that applying it directly to the soil, it is less likely to lead to any sort of groundwater pollution or burning your plant roots or whatever. It also means it will be a little harder to over-apply, which is good. If you worked it in to the soil directly, the soil may likewise be ready to utilize sooner rather than later, because typically with raw manure, you want to wait, and not just because of food safety, but also the potential to burn up plant roots with high nitrogen, or often in the case of horse manure, it's mixed with bedding, so it can actually tie up nitrogen in your soil. Now, if you dig into the pile and it smells ripe, like ammonia, then there's probably enough nitrogen left in it to get that pile composting, and just go ahead and make the compost pile. If you don't really run into that raw manure smell, then you probably will not be able to compost this manure very easily. That would require additional nitrogen, perhaps as at this point it will be largely carbon, as the nitrogen would have likely volatilized, off-gassed, or potentially leached out, depending on if it's exposed to rain or water. My experience, however, with horse stalls is that there is usually a pretty ripe core to these piles, depending on how it was managed, even relatively old piles. So you are probably all right on the nutrient front. On the persistent herbicide side of things, most of the persistent herbicides have a half-life of anywhere from 30 days to several years, and some will survive the composting process for a while as well. And not knowing what the animals were fed, it's hard to say. This is where, however, a bioassay might come in handy, mixing some of the horse manure with some soil that you know is not contaminated, and growing some beans or peas or whatever to look for issues in the growth. I will link the segment I did on that in the show notes for anyone who is like, what is this nerd on about with this bioassay thing? If it comes up with some herbicides in it, you will want to compost the stuff, or at least put it in a position to decompose for a while, which we'll talk about in the next segment. Somewhat paradoxically, composting can both concentrate these contaminants and also speed up their decomposition, especially if moisture is properly maintained. So just be sure to test it again after the compost process has ceased, or after it is rested for a while. This may also be a good idea in general for the third factor to consider: weed seed. I can't tell you how many poorly maintained horse pastures I've seen in the area with acres and acres of almost purely spiny amaranth, a weed seed that is adept at surviving the stomach of horses. So basically, horses eat the weed seeds, or eat the seed heads of weeds, or grasses with the seeds on them. Those seeds then make it through the digestive process and then come out with a nice batch of fertility on the other end. It's kind of genius, really. You could likewise get a bunch of the manure in a tray and water, just kind of like water it and see what germinates. You will also know soon enough if those more intense weeds are a problem on your farm. They will show themselves pretty early in the spring. So generally, my recommendation would be to pile the manure with some fresh cut grass clippings and get that pile working just to avoid any sort of potential issues. Hopefully that was helpful, Mike, and I'm sure you will let me know. Otherwise, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we will, preemptively for you, Mike, discuss how to get an old pile of manure composting. Be right back. Today's episode is also brought to you by Farmhand. Newsletters, right? A necessary evil for CSA farmers. Join Farmhand and real CSA farmers on April 11th for a free digital workshop where they'll share strategies they use to turn their newsletters into powerful sales tools. Get the secrets and go-to templates for success when you register for the free workshop today at farmhand.partners/newsletter. That's farmhand.partners/newsletter. And I'll put the link in the show notes. All right, back to the show. Our third and final Patreon question of the day comes to us from Patreon member Nadia. I'm saying it like that. It could just be Nadia, who writes, quote, "Hello from the Åland Islands, located between Finland and Sweden. I am passionate about soil and compost, and I am really trying to succeed in my home garden with what I can get a hold on. Last fall, I messed up. I was able to get a lot of cow manure, but I did also give birth to my third child, so my mind and energy were elsewhere. So I didn't have time to mix it with the brown material or spread it anywhere, so now I have a big pile of manure with no composting or heat happening. What can I do now? Is it too late to mix in it with brown material to get the composting started? And if it's too late, what do I do with it? Can I use it somehow?" End quote. Excellent and great to hear from you, and congrats on the third kid. I will have to add the Åland Islands to my list of places I visit when I'm on my apology tour in the area of Denmark and the Netherlands after mixing them up last week. And I mean, why not throw Sweden, Finland, and the Åland Islands in there just while I'm in the area? I will no doubt one day mix them up as well at some point anyway. So plus that place looks amazing. I don't know if you've ever Googled the Åland Islands. I have no idea if I'm saying it right, but it looks like it'd be a good time. I want to ride a bike across some of these islands. So I'll take the excuse. Anyway, I should probably get to your question. I figured these two topics would fit nicely together, and we'll just make a whole old manure show out of it. So I have discussed kickstarting old piles in the past, but it can be a challenge for sure. Kind of like we discussed in the last segment, the manure, unless it smells raw like manure still, will likely have lost some of its nitrogen and certainly some of its moisture. I'm assuming that the cow manure has some bedding mixed in, so the carbon may be fine. If it's mucky, you indeed may need to add a little bit of brown material. Sometimes getting a pile started is as simple as giving it a turn and dumping some water in there. If that doesn't work and it doesn't smell particularly manure-y, adding a little high nitrogen fertilizer in there, such as fish hydrolysate, as well as getting it fully saturated, again can do the trick. But sometimes it's a bit more involved to get it heated up again, and composting. Same as I would recommend for Mike. I feel like the spring is a superb time to get these things going though, because of the access to things like fresh cut grass clippings, which are incredibly fast at heating up when they're green and add a nice little bit of nitrogen with a pinch of carbon to the pile. So here's kind of the step-by-step that I would go with. One, dig into the pile with a fork and see if it still smells raw in the middle at all. Without being able to see it, myself, it may be very obvious to you that it is still largely just a big pile of raw manure, but it may not be. So I would make sure to dig in and just see what it looks like. If it does smell like manure, in that case, you may want to add just a small amount of brown material, straw or wood chips or whatever you have, plus some moisture. Remember, you should be able to squeeze a little bit of moisture out of it, but it should not be feel mucky. Give the pile a turn and see if that does the trick. If that doesn't work, or if it doesn't have that raw manure smell in the middle, then get some nitrogen of some sort, like grass clippings or some fish hydrolysate, or probably even some fish scraps, given your location. Mix it together as best you can and see if it will get things going for you again. If that works, following basic composting procedures, assuming you're not certified organic, then just turn it once or twice in the first 15 days and keep it reasonably moist and covered with a breathable tarp to preserve some moisture. Now, if none of that works, then you will basically have to start a separate compost pile and slowly incorporate the manure to get the weed seeds and potential, plant pathogens exposed to the heat. I might just use that old pile, honestly, that old pile of manure as a cap, like place it over top of a new pile and then cover that with a tarp so that the heat from the pile sort of lightly pasteurizes that older mix and gets rid of some of those weed seeds and or plant pathogens. Or alternatively, just give the pile a turn, get it moist, cover it, and allow for a longer timeline for its decomposition, likely several months in your climate. In that approach, the manure just slowly decomposes, called cold composting. This is not ideal because some of the nitrogen that the proper composting would have retained could be lost, plus the weed seeds and plant pathogens may remain viable, but it will eventually decompose into something more suitable for garden use. Anyway, I hope that's helpful. Let me know your all's thoughts and experiences with old manure, and I'm going to wrap it up there. Don't forget, we are now officially a 501c3, so donations are tax deductible and greatly appreciated. Please make sure to like and subscribe and or follow this podcast wherever you are getting it. That's an easy way to help us out. Enormous thank you to all of our show sponsors. Huge shouts to Willie Breeding for the theme music, Mike Hilbert for the production help and editing, and the team at No Till Growers. Also, shouts to Epidemic Sound for the background music that you can hear. Pick up a copy of the Living Soil Handbook or the Seed Farmer over at no-tillgrowers.com to support our work. Big thank you to everyone over at patreon.com/no-tillgrowers, where at a certain level, or if you just bump up from one level to another, or you sign up in the month of April, you get a shout out on the show. So big shout outs today to Vesaloya Gardens. Did I say that right? Vesaleya? Cedric Reed, Bill Price, William Wiley Mudrow, Richia Grant, Wish I Started 20 Years Ago, Dwight Yoder, Honey Works, Lynn Tompkins, Steve Hurlbut, Rebecca S., Mark Ravenel, Doug Wilkes, Lee Shelley, Brian McCarthy, Larry Shepard, Martian Cindy, DP, Kat Brannigan, Little Row Farms, Hank Zecca, Ashley Sharp, Jill Crosby, Scott Roser, Norsk Guard Farm, Laura Britton, Alex Savatsky, Alberto Diaz, Peter Broad, Jason Ruel, Earth Care Farmer Jane Murner, Derek Page, Meredith Light from Granite Springs Farm, Grown Up Farm, Bob and Ann Patton of Hexhamshire Organics, Jared Kirst at Rivendell Farms, Steve Larson, Fiona and Donnie of Firefly Farm, and Jen Lawrence. Okay, so in this story, this is like the monthlies or our pollinators. They are, this month, they are at a small farming conference over there in northern England, clearly visiting Bob and Ann Patton, like I would. And they're having a good old time, you know, doing the chatting thing and the looking at the farm thing, when all of a sudden a Scottish army on horseback appears in the distance. And just like that, this army is descending rapidly on the farm conference. And at first, everyone is wondering if it's kind of a reenactment or a joke of some sort. But then, as the army gets closer, they realize that no, this army has traveled through time. You can tell just by the way they look, presumably, or what they're saying. I don't know. And is going to attack. So our group start to run, but realizing they are quite outnumbered and not going to get away, they instead decide to confuse the army with their cell phones, and everyone sort of simultaneously turns on their favorite cat videos and holds their phones out. A really effective defense technique. And you know, the Scottish army kind of becomes confused by these small glowing boxes that contain cats doing cute things, and it ends up being quite disarming. And you know, they all just kind of sit around and explain how social media works. And anyway, I guess cat videos kind of transcend time in their cuteness, but crisis averted, and everyone makes some new friends. So yeah. Anyway, thanks for watching and or listening. We will see you tomorrow for Friday. Bye.